6,000 locomotives, 40 countries, 8 decades of iron and ingenuity poured into machines that moved the world. Montreal Locomotive Works built engines that hauled freight across the Andes, pulled passenger cars through the Indian subcontinent, and opened the African interior to trade. Canada didn't just use railways. Canada built them for everyone. Then the factory went quiet. No ceremony, no final whistle. Just the gradual accumulation of decisions made in boardrooms and government offices until one day the floor stopped vibrating, the machines went cold, and the men who knew how to build locomotives had nowhere to go. Today, every new locomotive running on Canadian National and Canadian Pacific tracks was built somewhere else. The country that fed the world's railways with Canadian iron and Canadian hands imports every unit. This is the story of how that happened and who chose to let it. Canada is not a country that happened to build railways. It is a country that exists because of them. The numbers make the case without argument. In 1867, the new Dominion stretched from the Atlantic coast to the edge of the Precambrian Shield, a political idea with almost no physical infrastructure to hold it together. The Western Territories were not yet provinces. British Columbia joined Confederation in 1871 on a single condition: a transcontinental railway within 10 years. It was not a request. It was the price of a country. The geography was the problem and the engine both. A nation of 9.9 million square kilometers, with its population clinging to a narrow band along the American border, needed railways the way it needed rivers, not as a convenience, but as the circulatory system without which nothing moved, nothing traded, nothing cohered. That necessity created industry. You cannot build thousands of kilometers of railway without steel, without foundries, without men who can work both. Montreal had all three. The port brought raw materials and skilled immigrants from Britain and continental Europe, men who arrived carrying trades in their hands. The St. Lawrence connected the city to the interior. The existing ironworks gave the supply chain its spine. By the time the Canadian Pacific's last spike was driven at Craigellachie in November 1885, Montreal had already become something more than a commercial city. It was the place where Canada's industrial identity was being forged, literally, in fire and iron. The locomotives would follow. Montreal Locomotive Works was founded in 1902 on Saint-Antoine Street in Montreal as a subsidiary of the American Locomotive Company, known as ALCO. The mandate was straightforward: build steam locomotives for the Canadian market so that ALCO's technology didn't have to cross the border as a finished product. It was a branch plant arrangement, practical and unsentimental, the kind of deal that made sense on a balance sheet. What grew on Saint-Antoine Street was something ALCO hadn't entirely planned for. The factory drew on Montreal's deep pool of skilled tradesmen, machinists, pattern makers, boiler makers, men whose fathers had worked iron in Glasgow and Lille and Porto, and who had brought the knowledge with them across the Atlantic. The work was hard, loud, and relentlessly physical. Locomotive frames were assembled in bays large enough to swallow a house. Boilers were riveted by hand in the early years. Each joint struck thousands of times until the seal was certain. The noise never stopped during a shift. You felt it in your back teeth. Through the 1920s and into the 1940s, MLW built the workhorses that moved Canada. Steam locomotives for Canadian Pacific, for Canadian National, for smaller regional lines that needed power and couldn't wait for American delivery schedules. The scale was considerable. The pride was real. Engineers who designed components on Saint-Antoine Street understood that their calculations would be tested daily across some of the most punishing terrain on Earth. The Rockies, the Precambrian Shield, the frozen approaches to Churchill, Manitoba. This was not a branch plant anymore. It was a center of genuine competence. The men who worked there knew it. The railways that bought the machines knew it. The world was still running on steam. That was about to change, and the change would require a decision. The diesel locomotive was not a better steam locomotive. It was a different machine entirely, and the railways understood the difference before the manufacturers did. Diesel required less maintenance. It did not need water towers every 100 kilometers. It could be started cold, without hours of preparation. A diesel crew spent their shift running the railway, not nursing a fire. For Canadian National and Canadian Pacific, operating across thousands of kilometers of territory where servicing infrastructure was sparse and labor was expensive, the arithmetic was not complicated. By the late 1940s, the transition was inevitable. The question for MLW was not whether to build diesels, but whose technology to build them with. They chose ALCO. The parent company had developed its own diesel platform, and MLW licensed the designs, retooled portions of the Saint-Antoine factory, and entered the new era as ALCO's Canadian expression. The logic was sound. The relationship was established. The technology existed. What MLW didn't control was what happened next in London, Ontario. General Motors Diesel had been manufacturing locomotives at its plant since 1950, using the EMD platform that GM had been developing and refining since the 1930s. The EMD engines were not dramatically superior to ALCO designs in raw engineering terms, but they were proven across an enormous installed base in the United States. Parts were available. Service networks existed. When a GMD locomotive broke down on the main line at 3 in the morning, the repair manual was familiar and the components were in stock. CN and CP began buying GMD in volume, not exclusively, not immediately, but consistently enough that the trajectory was clear. MLW held on, winning contracts at the margins, selling to smaller operators, competing on price where it couldn't compete on market momentum. The domestic war was being lost, quietly and incrementally, one purchase order at a time. What saved MLW from irrelevance in those years was not a better argument for the Canadian market. It was the discovery that the rest of the world needed locomotives and wasn't especially concerned about which platform built them. While GMD was winning the domestic argument, MLW was winning something larger. The post-war decades were the age of railway expansion across the developing world. Independence movements across Africa and Asia were producing new nations that needed infrastructure. South American governments were modernizing their freight networks. State railways from Buenos Aires to Bombay needed motive power, needed it in quantity, and needed suppliers who could deliver on terms that American manufacturers, focused on their own booming domestic market, were not always willing to offer. MLW offered, and MLW delivered. Locomotives built on Saint-Antoine Street ran freight through the Andes. They pulled passenger cars across the Indian subcontinent on meter-gauge track, a configuration that required specific engineering adaptations that Montreal handled without difficulty. They worked the South African rail network, the Mexican lines, the railways of Pakistan and Brazil. In Argentina alone, MLW became a dominant supplier across multiple decades, building machines calibrated for Argentine operating conditions, Argentine gauge specifications, Argentine expectations of durability in a country where a locomotive might spend 30 years in service before retirement. The numbers were not modest. Hundreds of units exported across dozens of countries. A Canadian factory supplying motive power to railways that connected cities, moved harvests, and carried the physical weight of economic development on 4 continents. There was genuine pride in this, and it was earned. The ALCO-derived designs that MLW refined and adapted were robust, maintainable in conditions where sophisticated parts supply chains didn't exist, and capable of absorbing the punishment of hard use on infrastructure that was itself still being built. A railway in Pakistan or Nigeria needed a locomotive that could be repaired by a skilled machinist with basic tooling. MLW built machines that rewarded that kind of attention. The paradox was stark and almost elegant. The company that was losing its home market was feeding the world. But the entire export operation rested on a foundation that MLW did not control. In 1969, that foundation was removed, and Montreal suddenly found itself alone with the technology and no parent to stand behind it. ALCO ceased locomotive production in 1969. After 67 years in the business, the American Locomotive Company simply stopped, unable to compete with EMD and GE on its own soil, unwilling to absorb further losses on a product line that the American market had decisively rejected. In Montreal, the decision arrived like a wall. MLW had built its entire technical identity around ALCO designs. The tooling, the engineering knowledge, the spare parts ecosystem, the export relationships, all of it had ALCO somewhere in the foundation. The parent was gone. The platform was orphaned. The question was whether the competence that had accumulated on Saint-Antoine Street over 6 decades was real enough to stand without American support underneath it. It was. MLW's engineers developed proprietary locomotive families, the M420 and M630 series, that were genuinely Canadian designs, drawing on the ALCO inheritance but extending beyond it. The M630 in particular represented serious engineering ambition, a high-horsepower road locomotive capable of competing on technical merit, not just price. Export customers in Mexico and elsewhere continued buying. The machines worked. The domestic market remained GMD territory. CN and CP were not interested in switching platforms mid-fleet, and MLW couldn't offer the parts availability and service infrastructure that decades of GMD penetration had built into the railway's operating assumptions. But the independent road was real. The competence was demonstrated. A Canadian company was designing and building locomotives without an American parent telling it how. That was 1969. Within 6 years, the ownership would change again. Laurent Baudouin acquired Montreal Locomotive Works in 1975. Bombardier at that point was primarily known for 2 things: the Ski-Doo snowmobile, which had made the company's fortune, and transit cars, which were making its reputation. It was not a locomotive company. Baudouin decided it would become one. The strategic logic was defensible. Bombardier had demonstrated it could manufacture complex rail vehicles. MLW brought engineering depth, export relationships, and a factory already tooled for heavy traction work. The combination, on paper, pointed toward a Canadian industrial champion capable of competing across the full spectrum of rail transportation. The reality was more complicated. The Bombardier MLW years produced genuine engineering work. The F12 and HR 616 locomotive families continued the tradition of serious design on Saint-Antoine Street. Export contracts to Mexico kept the production floor active. The machines that left the factory were capable and durable, as every railway that ran them for 30 years afterward would confirm. But CN and CP remained unmoved. The Canadian domestic market, the market that should have been the foundation of any viable locomotive business, continued to flow toward GMD and GE. Bombardier lobbied. Bombardier competed on price. Bombardier secured government contracts for via rail locomotive rebuilds that kept the lights on without resolving the underlying problem. The underlying problem was structural. Ottawa had no consistent Buy Canadian procurement policy that applied to railway equipment. The Crown corporations that operated Canada's freight and passenger railways made purchasing decisions on commercial terms, and on commercial terms, the established EMD and GE platforms won. Government contracts were a lifeline. A lifeline is not a business model. By the mid-1980s, Bombardier was facing a decision that Baudouin's original strategic logic had not resolved. The locomotive business was surviving. It was not thriving, and Bombardier, as a company, was about to discover where its future actually lay. Bombardier exited the locomotive business in the late 1980s. The decision was not announced with drama. There was no press conference designed to absorb the shock, no government inquiry, no national conversation about what was being surrendered. The factory on Saint-Antoine Street went quiet the way MLW had always feared it would, incrementally, then completely. EMD and GE transportation divided the Canadian market between them. Every locomotive ordered by CN and CP from that point forward was built in Illinois or Pennsylvania or Erie. The Canadian railroads that the Transcontinental Project had stitched together now ran entirely on imported power. What disappeared with the factory was larger than the factory. Montreal's locomotive industry had spent 8 decades building an ecosystem that never appeared on any balance sheet. Metallurgy shops that specialized in locomotive-grade steel alloys, electrical component manufacturers calibrated to traction motor specifications, tooling specialists whose knowledge lived in their hands as much as in any manual, apprenticeship programs that moved young men from the floor to the drafting table over years of accumulated competence. When the production stopped, the ecosystem stopped with it. The metallurgy shops found other customers or closed. The component manufacturers retooled or didn't. The apprenticeship programs ended because there was nothing left to apprentice toward. The men who knew how to build a locomotive retired, and their knowledge retired with them. This is the part that doesn't appear in the acquisition documents or the financial statements. Skills built across generations dissolved in a decade. The factory floor could theoretically be rebuilt. The human infrastructure that made it function cannot be reconstructed on a spreadsheet or recalled with a government grant. The silence on Saint-Antoine Street was not just the absence of noise. It was the absence of everything that had made the noise meaningful. The company that couldn't sell diesels to Canadian National went on to build metro cars for New York, Berlin, and London. Bombardier's transit division, the side of the business that locomotives had always overshadowed internally, became one of the most successful rail vehicle manufacturers on Earth. The Acela for Amtrak. Metro cars for dozens of cities across Europe and North America. High-speed train components for markets that France and Germany had spent decades cultivating. The Zafiro platform. TGV car production, a genuinely global presence in passenger rail that generated revenues the locomotive business never approached. The same company, entirely different outcome. The question of why deserves more than a footnote. Passenger rail vehicles attracted government support, procurement preferences, and industrial policy attention in ways that freight locomotives never did. European customers buying Bombardier products were often doing so within frameworks that valued the industrial relationship as much as the unit price. Ottawa, watching Bombardier succeed in transit while the locomotive business collapsed, drew no visible lesson from the contrast. Meanwhile, in Argentina and Mexico and the Indian subcontinent, MLW and Bombardier locomotives built on Saint Antoine Street were still running. Decades after the factory closed, machines assembled by Montreal tradesmen were hauling freight and passengers across railways that had never found a reason to retire them. The durability was not accidental. It was the physical record of what the engineers on Saint Antoine Street had actually built. France protected Alstom. Germany absorbed its rail manufacturers into industrial structures that survived market pressure through policy support. Japan never entertained the idea of sourcing railway equipment offshore when domestic production was viable. Canada watched its locomotive industry dissolve and imported the replacements. The MLW story is not unique in Canadian industrial history. Avro Arrow, Nortel, Massey Ferguson. The pattern is consistent enough to constitute policy, even if no policy was ever written down. Build world-class industrial capacity. Fail to protect it. Import the consequences. The locomotives are still running in Buenos Aires. The factory has been gone for 30 years. The geography hasn't changed. Canada is still a nation of distances that railways were built to cross. What changed was the choice. Not a single dramatic decision, but the accumulation of smaller ones. Procurement policies never written, protections never extended, lessons never drawn from the pattern repeating itself. Somewhere in Argentina, a locomotive assembled on Saint Antoine Street is still working. The men who built it are gone. The factory is gone. The apprenticeship programs, the tooling shops, the accumulated knowledge, gone. The railway runs. Canada watches it from the other side of a decision it doesn't remember making.